Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 15. The Irish Settlement. To know everything is to understand everything. The relief of the public at the Irish settlement was manifest. There was a general feeling of awaking from a nightmare. The whole empire rejoiced, and foreign countries smiled approvingly, if sardonically. The king took the usual and indeed unprecedented step of receiving the ministers concerned at Buckingham Palace in the early morning and had a photograph taken with himself in their midst. No one was more delighted than the poor, ordinary people of Ireland, who had been so mauled by both sides and who longed for peace and comfort. This, however, they were not to have for some time. The Sinn Féin delegates returned to Dublin immediately and presented the result of their labours to Mr. de Valera and the Dáil. It would be easy to prove that in logic de Valera was committed by his previous declarations not indeed to the actual form of the agreement but to its scope and principle. Moreover, the Irish delegates were plenipotentiaries and he was their chief. They had come as his representatives to London. He had been continually kept informed of the whole process of negotiation. They had gained in substance, if not in theory, all that they had striven for, and far more than any other Irish leaders had ever demanded. It was therefore generally expected that he would stand by his colleagues, make allowances for their difficulties, and even, if not satisfied on this or that theoretical point, would throw in his lot with them. After all, Southern Ireland had acquired the whole constitutional position of a dominion, that is to say, independence under the Crown, plus all the good offices of Great Britain. But we speedily learned that Mr. de Valera was still maundering about Poyning's Act, and that his view of Anglo-Irish relations and of the griefs of Ireland had not yet reached the 16th century part of the story. He now made a passionate endeavour to reopen the conflict, and conceiving himself as head of the only government existing in Ireland, he repudiated the action of the delegates, who were also his colleagues and had been his fellow conspirators. These men, reproached as traitors to their cause and to the oaths of their secret societies, were however immediately found to be in possession, even in the ranks of the extremists, of a strong separate power. 2 of the Irish signatories out of the 5 went over to de Valera, but Arthur Griffith, supported by Duggan, acted with energy and conviction, and Michael Collins, carrying with him the principal gunmen and the majority of the inmost circles of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, stood by his friend. While their territory was still in the utmost confusion, the Dáil proceeded to debate the treaty, for weeks at a time. They adjourned at length to celebrate the Nativity of the Saviour, and when they resumed in January, they were cleft in twain. On January 8 the vote was taken and the treaty was carried by 7 votes, 64 against 57. De Valera resigned his presidency and quitted the chamber. All the Republicans having walked out, Mr. Arthur Griffith was elected president of the Dáil, which then was immediately adjourned. Shortly after the signing of the treaty, I became a principal in the British-Irish affairs. In January 1921, the Prime Minister had asked me to go from the War Office to the Colonial Office for the purpose of settling our affairs in Palestine and Mesopotamia. This work was now nearly done. The Arabs and Colonel Lawrence were appeased by the enthronement of King Faisal at Baghdad. The British army in Mesopotamia, which had been costing 30 millions a year, had been brought home, and complete tranquillity was preserved by the Royal Air Force under the guidance of the thrifty Trenchard. Footnote: Marshal of the Air Force Sir Hugh Trenchard. Chief of the Air Staff. Those who wish for further information on this long and intricate piece of public business will find a memorandum in the appendix. Winston S. Churchill. End of footnote. Apart from ordinary work, I was therefore free. Southern Ireland, as a dominion, fell constitutionally into the sphere of the colonial office. I took over the task from the Chief Secretary, Sir Hamer Greenwood. He had borne the brunt during the most terrible period, showing the utmost courage as a man, and never losing the hope of a statesmanlike solution. In my capacity as Secretary of State, I became chairman of the Cabinet Committee upon Irish Affairs. My colleagues gave me generous aid when I required it and a wide freedom of action at other times. Thenceforward, I conducted all the negotiations with the Irish leaders, both North and South, and dealt with all the parliamentary situations in the House of Commons. Two objectives stood clearly out from the general confusion and uncertainty. The first was to bring and nurse into being in the South a living and responsible organism of government. This could only be done by investing the provisional government, which we were about to recognize, with the authority of a popular election. From the moment of publication of the treaty, the Irish people had by every means and method open to them loudly expressed their desire that good and peaceful relations should be established with the British people on the basis of that settlement. We therefore impressed upon the provisional government the importance and urgency of an election, which alone could give them the status of a national administration and enable them to govern with native authority. Griffith and Collins were fully persuaded of this, but the difficulties were enormous. Mr. de Valera, knowing himself to be in a minority, and, as it proved, in a small minority, set to work by every means in his power to obstruct, to delay, and if possible to prevent such an election. For this purpose he had recourse to the Irish Republican Army. This so-called army had hitherto existed for the object of organizing attacks on the Crown forces ranging from individual murder to ambuscades. It had never been capable of fighting any serious action according to the rules of war. Nevertheless, it contained a considerable number of men perfectly ready to suffer imprisonment and execution for what they considered to be their cause. The Irish Republican Army was divided in opinion in the same way and probably in the same proportion as the Dáil. Yet it was the only organization at the disposal of the provisional government for the maintenance of their authority. They were therefore forced into a series of weak and unsatisfactory compromises upon the control of the Republican Army and about the date and character of the elections. They were soon led, as a measure of accommodation with Mr. de Valera, to postpone the election for 3 months, relying upon his promise that then the election should be free, that in the meanwhile the army should act unitedly under the orders of the provisional government, and that it should not interfere in the election or oppose by force any government returned at the election. But Mr. de Valera had no sooner made this promise to his fellow countrymen than he proceeded to break it. Everything was done by him and by his friends to weaken and discredit the provisional government, to create disorder throughout the country, and to embroil Southern Ireland with Ulster. For this purpose, the anti-Free State portion of the Republican Army was always available, and around them and behind them gathered those predatory and criminal elements which, in a greater or less degree, exist in every society and claim to lead in times of revolution. It was across these difficulties that the British and Irish signatories of the treaty endeavored to march to a free election and an Irish national mandate. The second main objective, equally vital to us, was to sustain the Ulster government in its undefeasible rights. Two so-called divisions of the Irish Republican Army were located in Ulster and were maintained in intense secret activity in spite of the truce, and in spite of the treaty, and in spite of the fact that the evacuation of the British Army from Southern Ireland was rapidly and steadily proceeding. The Ulster government therefore found themselves at grips with a conspiracy in their midst, the object of which was to make their task of maintaining a separate government impossible, while at the same time, from over the border, serious raids occurred and hostile forces gathered and threatened. These menaces to Ulster, both internal and from without, were met in an equally combative and bellicose manner by the Protestant Orangemen of the north. Every outrage committed by the Irish Republican Army or by the Catholic element was repaid with bloody interest. Reprisals and counter-reprisals soon built up a ghastly score on both sides. The Catholics, being numerically the weaker, suffering during the summer about twice as many casualties as the Protestants. It was no doubt natural that the Sinn Féin extremists, having seen the success which attended their attack on British authority, should expect by a continuance of such methods to break down a much smaller and apparently much weaker organism of government in the north. Having, as they thought, humiliated and beaten the mighty British Empire and forced it to make an accommodation with them, they assumed it would be an easy matter to make the position of a separate Ulster government impossible, and by shooting public men and burning public buildings to create a continuous terror, and so to weary and impoverish the government and the citizens of the north, that for the sake of a quiet life they would be willing to submit themselves to Sinn Féin rule. In the north, as I said to the House of Commons at a later period, the large majority of the people are bitterly opposed to Sinn Féin. They ardently proclaim their loyalty and affection for this country, for its monarchy, for its constitution, and for its empire. Even if they were deserted by Britain, they would fight desperately and rightly to preserve their freedom. But they will not be deserted by Britain. On the contrary, they will be aided and strengthened by money, arms, and men to any extent that may be necessary to help them to maintain their parliamentary and political rights and to defend themselves. These were the two separate aims by which I was guided. They appealed very differently to English political parties. All the strongest elements in the Conservative Party rallied to Ulster, and even while recognizing and accepting the treaty, recoiled with dislike and scorn from Sinn Féin Ireland. Liberals and Labour men, on the other hand, watched with tender solicitude the fortunes of the Irish Free State, and took little interest in the welfare of the northern government, except to denounce it for the reprisals with which the Orangemen repaid every Sinn Féin murder. But if success in undoubted measure attended our policy, it was due to the fact that we pursued both these separate and, in many respects, antagonistic objectives with equal earnestness. Either alone spelled ruin. Both simultaneously pursued led to safety and peace. Of course, the task of helping both sides in some directions and of restraining both as far as possible in others was delicate and liable to be misunderstood. It is easy to declare that the balance should be held even, but when people are actually murdering each other and being murdered, when terror stalks the land and anarchy rises about infant administrations, when you are in constant and intimate and honorable relations with the champions of both sides, when you know many of their secrets, and when anything done for one excites the resentment or suspicion of the other, an impartial course is easier to prescribe than to steer. Fortunately for Ireland, she did not in this time of tribulation lack chiefs of high and firm qualities. In Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins, and also in two new figures who now appeared, Richard Mulcahy and Kevin O'Higgins, were found realists of the first order, men who feared God, who loved their country and who kept their word. In Ulster, Sir James Craig stood solid as a rock. Imperturbable, sagacious, above hate or anger, yet not without a lively sentiment. Steady, true, and untiring, he brought his own people at length out from the midst of indescribable miseries and difficulties back to daylight and civilization. With this general survey of scene and actors, it will be better to tell the tale selectively by contemporary documents rather than by summarized narrative. I started hopefully on my duties, and endeavored to outline for the guidance of the departments concerned the immediate practical steps. December 21, 1921. The Prime Minister having asked me to preside over a cabinet committee for the purpose of arranging the details of setting up a provisional government in Dublin should a favourable decision be taken by the Dáil. I have put down a few draft headings for consideration. Should the Dáil ratify, the first step should be to get an Irish delegation comprising Mr. Griffith and Mr. Collins over here at the earliest moment. We should then tell them that we wish them to form a provisional government without delay. This government should be immediately responsible for the whole internal peace and order of Southern Ireland and would take executive control of the country on the basis arranged. We do not wish to continue responsible one day longer than is absolutely necessary. In my view, we should aim at New Year's Day for the definite assumption of power, provided they are willing. When the basis has been worked out, it will be for the Viceroy, after consultation in Dublin with such leaders of parties and political personages as he thinks fit, to invite some gentlemen to form a government. Presumably he would invite Mr. Arthur Griffith, and we shall know by then whether this gentleman will accept the commission, and on what basis. Mr. Griffith would then form his government. His ministers would sign the declaration prescribed in the treaty and take up their duties without delay. As a general principle, we should not seek to alter the existing machinery more than is absolutely necessary, but should place it in the hands of the new ministers as it now is. If statutory authority to give directions of any kind is required, and such authority cannot yet be obtained, the British authority, who now has the power to give such directions, should be told to act upon instructions received without personal responsibility, except for execution. The following special points occur. 1. The police. Every man in the RIC, whether English or Irish, should be given the option of resigning on disbandment terms guaranteed by the imperial government. The allocation of expense as between Great Britain and the Irish Free State must be taken into consideration on the general financial settlement which will be made during the present year, so that it is only a question of accounting. All RIC who do not exercise this option will be expected to carry on. The auxiliary divisions will be disbanded at once at the cost of the imperial government, advantage being taken at the same time of the decision provisionally arrived at to raise a gendarmerie for Palestine. 2. The army. The principle we should proclaim is that the whole of our military forces in Southern Ireland should be withdrawn as quickly as convenient. The provisional government will be expected to take over the guard of the Viceroy and of the seat of government with uniformed troops of their own as the first step. The routine of salutes, guards of honour, etc. due to the King's representative must be arranged with the Sinn Féin leaders. The normal Irish garrisons outside Dublin would, I presume, remain until barrack accommodation can be found for them elsewhere and the Free State government are prepared to dispense with them. But ostentatious preparations to quit should be begun everywhere. It is quite possible that in 2 or 3 months very insistent demands will be made for some of them to stay permanently. This, I fear, we shall not be able to accede to except as a matter of convenience for the new government and for a very limited period. All the additional troops in Ireland not accommodated in permanent peacetime barracks should quit at the very earliest moment. All troops remaining in Ireland should, from the date of assumption of office by the provisional government, be moved outside their cantonments and immediate stations only in accordance with arrangements agreed upon with the responsible ministers. They should act in support of the civil power only on requisitions signed by the responsible ministers. The provisional government should be legally authorized to raise forces as may be necessary in the transition period under the Territorial Forces Act. It is not presumed they will wish to raise their full quota until they are definitely established. It is, however, of high importance that there should be at the earliest moment an Irish force uniformed and disciplined and capable of supporting the civil power. 3. Justice. The necessity for Sinn Féin courts will presumably have disappeared, as all the courts will become Free State courts at the earliest moment. Meanwhile, however, it is presumed the existing courts would function, the Viceroy being advised on the exercise of prerogative by the Prime Minister or Home Secretary of the Irish Free State. The Attorney General will, it is hoped, explain how the transition is to be effected in this sphere. 4. Finance. No alteration whatever at present in the taxes nor in the spending of money on the ordinary internal services of the country. The interceptions which have lately been in force should of course cease at once, the full sum for Irish internal administration being made available. Funds must also be provided for the raising of the Irish Free State forces for the maintenance of order. 5. Education, agriculture, and internal administrative services generally. Full responsibility for these should be placed on the shoulders of a Free State minister at the earliest moment. 6. Measures relating to indemnity and amnesty must be prepared. The above notes are on the assumption that the Dáil ratifies the treaty. It is possible, however, that they may ratify, but by a majority insufficiently large to afford a lasting basis of settlement. In this case, the new government should still take office, and should themselves ask the Viceroy either for a dissolution or for a plebiscite. A dissolution is infinitely preferable, as it will give a more responsible Dáil. The Viceroy would be guided by the advice received from the ministers on this subject, and in the event of such advice being in favour of a plebiscite, the necessary machinery must be brought into being by the Irish departments, funds being supplied on the authority of the Treasury in anticipation of parliamentary sanction. Pending this appeal to the country, all troops and police would stand fast as at present, but otherwise the procedure would be as above, though in a modified form. A third alternative is the rejection of the treaty by the Dáil. In this case, it is presumed that the Parliament of Southern Ireland would be dissolved and a general election for a new Dáil held immediately. We should, however, before deciding, get into touch with the leaders of the ratification party in the existing Dáil and ascertain their wishes. It is presumed that the treaty would be resubmitted to the new Dáil as soon as it assembled. On January 11, I was surprised and glad to receive a letter from Sir James Craig, who had been for some time officially out of touch with His Majesty's government. He offered to come to see me at any time when the interests of Ulster were affected. He added, "I am quite ready to attend a conference between you and the delegates of Southern Ireland. In fact, I would welcome an opportunity of meeting Mr. Griffith, or whoever may be charged with the administration of the provisional government, at an early date, so as to ascertain clearly whether the policy of Southern Ireland is to be one of peace or whether the present method of pressure on Northern Ireland is to be continued. I lost no time in bringing Craig and Michael Collins together. On January 21 they met in my room at the Colonial Office, which, despite its enormous size, seemed overcharged with electricity. They both glowered magnificently, but after a short, commonplace talk, I slipped away upon some excuse and left them together. What these two Irishmen, separated by such gulfs of religion, sentiment, and conduct, said to each other, I cannot tell. But it took a long time, and, as I did not wish to disturb them, mutton chops, etc. were tactfully introduced about 1 o'clock. At 4 o'clock the private secretary reported signs of movement on the All-Ireland front, and I ventured to look in. They announced to me complete agreement reduced to writing. They were to help each other in every way. They were to settle outstanding points by personal discussion. They were to stand together within the limits agreed against all disturbances of the peace. We three then joined in the best of all pledges, to wit, to try to make things work. Alas, it was not to be so easy. When little more than a week had passed, Craig had to give reassurance to the Ulstermen, and Collins, back in Dublin atmosphere, was making violent speeches about the Ulster boundary. And the southern boycott of Belfast, which had been lifted on January 24, was soon resumed in full intensity. Early in February, Sinn Féin raids took place on the Ulster border, and the simultaneous disturbances which broke out in Belfast left during a single night 30 dead and 70 injured in the streets. It was therefore upon a considerable disappointment that I had to introduce the Irish Free State Bill implementing the treaty on February 16. All the Ulster members, with their strong influence throughout the Conservative Party, openly declared their opposition. Reading the debate again, I see how carefully I had to walk. The general feeling was that the treaty was necessary, but would it be observed? Had we been hoodwinked, or, at the best, had we negotiated with men of straw? Had we not given all we had to give and received in return only a grimace? On the other hand, what else was there to do at the moment? I had to appeal to faith, hope, and law. If you want to see Ireland degenerate into a meaningless welter of lawless chaos and confusion, delay this bill. If you wish to see increasingly serious bloodshed all along the borders of Ulster, delay this bill. If you want this House to have on its hands, as it now has, the responsibility for peace and order in Southern Ireland without the means of enforcing it, if you want to impose those same evil conditions upon the Irish Provisional Government, delay this bill. If you want to enable dangerous and extreme men working out schemes of hatred and subterranean secrecy to undermine and overturn a government which is faithfully doing its best to keep its word with us and enabling us to keep our word with it, delay this bill. If you want to proclaim to all the world, week after week, that the British Empire can get on just as well without law as with it, then you will delay this bill. But if you wish to give a fair chance to a policy to which Parliament has pledged itself and to Irish ministers towards whom you are bound in good faith, so long as they act faithfully with you, to give fair play and a fair chance, if you wish to see Ireland brought back from the confusion of tyranny to a reign of law, if you wish to give logical and coherent effect to the policy and experiment to which we are committed, you will not impede, even for a single unnecessary week, the passage of this bill. Ought we to regret having made the settlement and signed the treaty? Contrast the positions. It appears to me as if the tables were turned. Ireland, not Britain, is on her trial before the nations of the world. 6 months ago it was we who had to justify ourselves against every form of attack. Now it is the Irish people who, as they tell us, after 700 years of oppression, have at last an opportunity to show the kind of government that they can give to their country and the position which they can occupy among the nations of the world. An enormous improvement in the situation, as I see it, has been effected in the last 6 months. Take the position of Ulster. The position of Ulster is one of great and unshakable strength, not only material strength, but moral strength. There was a time when, as is well known, I and others with whom I was then associated thought that Ulster was not securing her own position, but was barring the way to the rest of Ireland to obtain what they wanted. Those days are gone. Ulster, by a sacrifice and by an effort, has definitely stood out of the path of the rest of Ireland, and claims only those liberties and securities which are her own, and standing on her own rights, supported as she is, and as she will be by the whole force and power, if necessary, of the British Empire, I am entitled to say is in a position of great moral and material strength at the present time. The position of the imperial government has also become greatly improved. It is very desirable that the great affairs of the British Empire should be increasingly detached from the terrible curse of this long internal Irish quarrel, and that the august imperial authority should stand on a more impartial plane. The gravamen of the Ulster complaint was the article of the treaty which prescribed the future regulation of the boundary between North and South. Of course, all this trouble in regard to boundaries surrounds the boundaries of Fermanagh and Tyrone. I remember on the eve of the Great War we were gathered together at a cabinet meeting in Downing Street, and for a long time, an hour or an hour and a half after the failure of the Buckingham Palace Conference, we discussed the boundaries of Fermanagh and Tyrone. Both of the great political parties were at each other's throats. The air was full of talk of civil war. Every effort was made to settle the matter and bring them together. The differences had been narrowed down not merely to the countries of Fermanagh and Tyrone, but to parishes and groups inside the areas of Fermanagh and Tyrone, and yet even when the differences had been so narrowed down, the problem appeared to be as insuperable as ever, and neither side would agree to reach any conclusion. Then came the Great War. Every institution almost in the world was strained. Great empires have been overturned. The whole map of Europe has been changed. The position of countries has been violently altered. The mode and thought of men, the whole outlook on affairs, the grouping of parties, all have encountered violent and tremendous changes in the deluge of the world. But as the deluge subsides and the waters fall, we see the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerging once again. The integrity of their quarrel is one of the few institutions that have been unaltered in the cataclysm which has swept the world. That says a lot for the persistency with which Irishmen, on the one side or the other, are able to pursue their controversies. It says a great deal for the power which Ireland has, both nationalist and Orange, to lay her hands upon the vital strings of British life and politics, and to hold, dominate, and convulse, year after year, generation after generation, the politics of this powerful country. I concluded, after much argument, Ulster must have British comfort and protection. Ireland must have her treaty, her election, and her constitution. There will be other and better opportunities of dealing with the difficult boundary question. For generations we have been floundering in the Irish bog, but at last we think that in this treaty we have set our feet upon a pathway which has already become a causeway, rather narrow but firm and far-reaching. Let us march along this causeway with determination and circumspection, without losing heart and without losing faith. If Britain continues to march forward along that path, the day may come, it may be distant, but it may not be as distant as we expect, when, turning round, Britain will find at her side Ireland united, a nation and a friend. The debate following was worthy of the issue. The general opinion was well expressed by Mr. Neville Chamberlain. I, for one, am not going to be exasperated by outrages into changing my opinion as to the proper course to pursue. I consider in these difficult times that our business is to keep our heads, not to allow ourselves to be flustered into causes we may regret hereafter, but to give all the powers that are necessary to enable the provisional government to establish itself securely and to carry out its proper obligations, and that in that way we may at any rate save for ourselves the only hope there is of escaping civil war. The majority was overwhelming, 302 to 60. But most of the majority were miserable and all the minority were furious. It took more than a month to pass the bill. During this time the dissatisfaction and anxieties of Parliament and the public were continually fanned by cruel and treacherous crimes and by the obvious impotence of the only possible Irish government. More serious disturbances had occurred early in February. Raids across the Ulster border resulted in the kidnapping of Northerners. A reinforcement of Northern Constabulary dispatched from Belfast to Enniskillen, where by an unlucky forgetfulness of the new frontier sent via Clones in the Free State, instead of by the longer, safer route through the Northern Territory. On the arrival of the train at Clones, these 19 men, treated as invaders, were ambuscaded. Without warning or challenge, 4 were killed, 8 wounded and 7 captured. At the same time Mr. Collins flooded me with protests about the vendettas and counter-vendettas proceeding nightly in Belfast. This merciless episode reduced the border to barbaric conditions. Many other outrages occurred throughout Ireland. There would have been more had it not been that throughout southern Ireland not only the Loyalists but the mass of the population subsided abjectly under the terror. In Belfast a foul kind of warfare was maintained fiercely by the dregs of both religions. It was a long way to Tipperary, but at last apparently we arrived there. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Cope. Footnote. Now Sir Alfred Cope, K.C.B., a daring and trustworthy agent of the British government who was closely involved in the treaty negotiations and ardent throughout for settlement. End of footnote. March 7, 1922. Personal and secret. Many questions are asked me about Limerick and Tipperary. You must let me know what the provisional government are really doing, telling me whether the information must be kept secret or not. Do they intend to put down the Limerick revolt, or are they just going to parley and continue to be set at defiance? There are reports in the papers that Irish troops have been dispatched from Dublin to an unknown destination. Is this true? How many? Are they to be trusted? The position in Cork seems as bad as ever, and it is reported that a notorious man who had been captured has now escaped. Do you think there is any fighting quality in the Free State government? Will anybody die for it or kill for it? Let me know your view, not your wish. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Collins, March 14, 1922. Private and personal. I have read with attention your letter about the Belfast outrages in 1920–21. I note that you are going to send me a statement about more recent events in Belfast. I send you herewith a report from Sir James Craig, with which he has furnished me in response to your previous communication of complaints. The state of affairs in Belfast is lamentable. There is an underworld there with deadly feuds of its own, and only the sternest and strictest efforts by leading men on both sides, coupled with ample military and police forces, will produce that tranquillity which is demanded by the interests of Ireland as a whole. 2. I had long conversations with Sir James Craig before he returned to Ulster, and I am sure that he will do his very utmost to maintain order impartially. He has so far steadily declined to entertain the idea of a further conference with your government, on the ground that while you are illegally holding the clansmen as hostages, he cannot meet you. So here we are at a deadlock for the moment. I am bound to say that Sir James Craig left me with the impression that he would be glad to see the obstacles removed and to have a further parley. I quite see your difficulties, but I have no doubt whatever that in spite of them you ought to put yourself in the right by either effecting the release of these men or bringing them to trial in the regular way on a definite charge before lawfully constituted tribunals. Sir James Craig would be quite satisfied if they have a fair trial and are dealt with according to law. This is surely the only line for heads of governments to take. It may be that you do not feel able to do this till the bill is through and you are formally equipped with lawful powers. If so, there is nothing for it but to wait and keep things as calm and as cool as possible in the interval. This hostage business is more suited to the Balkans than to Ireland, and the sooner we get on to a normal footing, the better. 3. I am very much obliged to you for having speeded up the transfer of the necessary staff to the north of Ireland. And I hear from Sir John Anderson, footnote, a civil servant of the highest rank, sent to Dublin in 1920 as Under-Secretary to the Lord Lieutenant and Secretary to the Treasury for Ireland, a man of singular capacity and firmness of character, sagacious and imperturbable amid gathering peril and confusion. End of footnote. And I hear from Sir John Anderson that the administrative efficiency of your government is increasing every week, that the provisional ministers are getting a good grip, and are appointing good men as their agents, and that in finance, particularly systems, the soundness of which has been proved by experience, are being adopted. 4. I am very glad you are seeing Lord Middleton, representing the Southern Unionists, today, and I hope you will be able to reassure him about land purchase. We are pledged to the hilt to do our part in this matter if the Free State call upon us to do so, and the advantage accrues entirely to Ireland as against the larger and more unlucky island. 5. I hear from quite an independent source that the provisional government is gaining ground all over the country, and that one of the principal supporters of de Valera has expressed the opinion that they will do well if they get 40 seats in the new parliament. I hope this is so. 6. You seem to have liquidated the Limerick situation in one way or another. No doubt you know your own business best, and thank God you have got to manage it and not we. An adverse decision by the Convention of the Irish Republican Army, so-called, would, however, be a very grave event at the present juncture. I presume you are quite sure there is no danger of this. 7. I read with great interest the full report of the speech delivered by you in Dublin, which Lady Lavery sent me. I wish it had been reported more fully in the English papers. I showed it to the Lord Chancellor, who praised its tone and diction and will possibly quote some passages from it in his defense of the Free State Bill this week. 8. I am much interested in your visit to Cork, and especially in the fact that you appear to have been welcomed by the Irish ex-servicemen with whom I sympathize so much. I shall do my best to get a further extension in regard to Hall Bowline Dockyard, as I am most anxious that the Cork situation shall adjust itself satisfactorily. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Collins and Mr. Griffith, March 21, 1922. The whole position on the border is undoubtedly becoming more dangerous. An explosion would be disastrous, and even a continuance of the present tension tends to stereotype the borderline and make it into a fortified military frontier, which is the last thing in the world you want. I cannot think there is the slightest danger of a raid from the north into the south. If such a raid took place, those making it would put themselves in the wrong, and the British government would take every measure in its power. I am certain that you do not need to be alarmed on this score. Even if it happened, it would only do harm to those responsible, just in the same way as the kidnapping raids from Monaghan have done harm to Southern Irish interests. I am told that IRA, so-called, are collecting along the border in increasing numbers. Surely this is not necessary. Statements also appear in the papers that Free State troops are stationed at various points. Pray let me know exactly what is happening. You must understand that I am at the same time making the strongest representations to Sir James Craig to prevent provocative action on the part of his people. On April 13, a high-souled fanatic, Rory O'Connor, with a band of adherents and many sympathizers, seized the law courts in Dublin. In this venerable and massive building, he and his friends proclaimed themselves the Republican government of all Ireland. 3 days later, Michael Collins was murderously attacked in Dublin. He escaped, but during the rest of the month, the murder of Free State troops and police continued, diversified by a general railway strike. In these pressures, a tormented government and its servants rallied somewhat. Their troops began to fire back, and even this slight resistance startled their enemies. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Collins, April 12, 1922. On the whole, my impression is that public opinion is increasingly mobilizing and asserting itself in Ireland, and that you will get very strong national support in defending your just and lawful position. I have been speaking in this sense in the House of Commons. I hope that Easter will not belie these anticipations. The Cabinet instructed me to send you a formal communication expressing their growing anxiety at the spread of disorder in the 26 counties. Instead of this, however, I write to you as man to man. Many residents are writing to this country tales of intimidation, disorder, theft and pillage. There is no doubt that capital is taking flight. Credits are shutting up, railways are slowing down, business and enterprise are baffled. The wealth of Ireland is undergoing a woeful shrinkage. Up to a certain point, no doubt, these facts may have the beneficial effect of rousing all classes to defend their own material interests, and Mr. de Valera may gradually come to personify not a cause but a catastrophe. It is difficult for us over here to measure truly, but it is obvious that in the long run the government, however patient, must assert itself or perish and be replaced by some other form of control. Surely the moment will come when you can broadly and boldly appeal not to any clique, sect or faction, but to the Irish nation as a whole. They surely have a right to expect you to lead them out of the dark places, and the opportunity is one, the loss of which history will never forgive. Ought you not to rally round the infant Free State or the elements in Ireland which will wholeheartedly adhere to the treaty and sign a declaration attaching them to it irrespective of what their former attitudes have been? Would you not find reserves on this basis infinitely more powerful than any you have obtained at the present time? Ought you not to summon your far-flung people to your aid? Footnote. Mr. Collins had used this phrase about the Irish race in conversation a few weeks earlier. We too are far-flung people. End of footnote. In America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, there must be hundreds of Irishmen intensely devoted to the welfare and freedom of their native land who would come to see fair play over the elections and make sure that the people had a free vote. I am greatly impressed by the courage with which such large numbers of Irishmen have attended public meetings to testify to their opinions in spite of so many deterrents, and I feel at the tips of my fingers the growing national strength that is behind you, ready for use when the moment comes for no cause but your own. I am going into the question of your claim for an inquiry into some post-agreement outrages in Belfast. I will have a talk with Sir James Craig and let you know the result. Things are settling down to some extent, both in Belfast and on the frontier, and there is no doubt that the Ulster government is making a tremendous effort towards appeasement. They will be greatly helped by the release of the Clones specials, which I am very glad to see you have achieved. I am glad to see you have arranged a meeting with De Valera, but I hope you will understand that we cannot go any further in any respect. We have run every risk and made every effort and fulfilled every stipulation according to the agreement we signed with you. But that is the end absolutely so far as we are concerned, and every one of us will swing round with every scrap of influence we can command against a republic or any inroad upon the treaty structure. It would seem to me also extremely dangerous to allow any further delay in the elections to be extorted from you. Every day that the uncertainty continues must be attended by the progressive impoverishment of Ireland. Nobody can invest or make plans for production while the threat of civil war or of a republic followed by a state of war with the British Empire hangs over the country. I trust the end of May or at the very latest the first week in June will see the issue submitted to the Irish people. We really have a moral right to ask that the uncertainty as to whether our offer is accepted or rejected should not be indefinitely prolonged. Mr. Churchill to Mr. Collins, April 29, 1922. It is now 3 weeks since I wrote to you last, and it may be well to review a little what has passed in the interval. First, let me congratulate you and Mr. Griffith on the spirit and personal courage which you have consistently shown in confronting the enemies of free speech and fair play. I have no doubt that the development of strong, bold, romantic personalities at the head of the Irish Provisional Government and among the leaders of the Treaty Party will be of real value in the general situation. I also sustain the impression that the great swing of Irish opinion is increasingly towards the Free State and the Treaty, and those who stand for them, and that for every manly reason large numbers of persons will endeavor to assert their political rights at the poll. From this point of view, the delay has not turned out nearly so badly as we in this country feared. You have not lost your hold on public opinion. You have indeed strengthened it. The excesses of the De Valera faction and the consequent inconvenience and impoverishment of Ireland have to a large extent concentrated the discontent, not upon the government, but upon its opponents. I read with very great interest in the Irish papers the excellent speeches which are made and the courageous and energetic manner in which the Irish press defends the essentials of social freedom. Easter is passed without disaster. Your troops are increasing in numbers and appear to stand to their engagements and obey their officers. Altogether, I see many sober reasons for hope. This makes me wonder all the more why you adopt such a very harsh tone in dealing with Sir James Craig. I am sure he has made a very great effort to fulfill the agreement in the letter and in the spirit, and that he is continuously and will continue striving in that direction. Of course, no one expected that everything could be made right immediately, or that the terrible passions which are loose in Ireland would not continue to produce their crop of outrages, dishonoring to the island and its people, and naturally you have many grounds of complaint against him. He too has furnished me with a long set of counter-complaints, and the Protestants also have suffered heavily in the recent disturbances. Belfast goods of very great value, running into millions, have been destroyed. Debts owing to Belfast have been collected illegally and intercepted, and the boycott, I am assured, is more injurious in fact than ever before. Instead of these rough communications, I should have thought that the Irish leaders, North and South, would have found it much better to meet together, to take stock of the position, to record what has been achieved, to mark what has fallen short in the working of the late agreement, and to decide on new steps to complete its execution. As I have frequently pointed out, the interests of your opponents, North and South, Orange and Green, is to provoke the worst state of feeling between the two parts of Ireland, and they would cheerfully welcome every step and every event which led up to a definite civil war between the two governments. Your opponents in the North hope to see a republic in the South because it will bring about inter alia such a civil war in which they know they will have the whole force of the British Empire behind them. Your opponents in the South hope to use antagonism against Ulster as a means of enabling them to snatch the power from the hands of the provisional government, or else involve them in a series of events so tragical that they will break up under the strain. And on both sides the wreckers dread any approach to the idea of a united Ireland as the one fatal final blow at their destructive schemes. All this seems perfectly simple to me, and I think these people judge rightly according to their own tactical view. What I do not understand is why you should let yourself be drawn into the quarrel. I know Craig means to play fair and straight with you, and I do not think you will find such another man in the whole of the North. And it perplexes and baffles me when I see you taking up such a very strong and even aggressive attitude against him in your public utterances. Although perhaps you get some political advantage for the moment by standing up stiffly against the North, yet every farthing of that advantage is drawn and squandered from the treasure chest of Irish unity. However provoking it may be, I am certain that your interest and that of the cause you serve demands patience and suavity in all that concerns relations with the North. They are your countrymen and require from you at least as careful and diplomatic handling as you bestow on the extremists who defy you in the South. Moreover, they are in a very strong and, in fact, inexpugnable position, and they hold in their hands the key to Irish unity. When you feel moved to anger by some horrible thing that has happened in Belfast, it may perhaps give you some idea of our feelings in Great Britain when we read of the murder of the helpless, disarmed Royal Irish Constabulary, and now, this morning, of what is little less than a massacre of Protestants in and near Cork. 20 constabulary men have been shot dead and 40 wounded, together with 6 or 7 soldiers, and now these 8 Protestant civilians within the jurisdiction of your government since the treaty was signed. All these men were under the safeguard of the Irish nation and were absolutely protected in honor by the treaty. Their blood calls aloud for justice and will continue to call as the years pass by until some satisfaction is accorded. As far as I know, not a single person has been apprehended, much less punished, for any of these cruel deeds. Yet we on our side have faithfully proceeded step by step to carry out the treaty, have loyally done our utmost to help your government in every way, and have not lost confidence in the good faith and goodwill of those with whom we signed the treaty. But do not suppose that deep feelings do not stir on both sides of the Channel. We too are a people not altogether to be treated as negligible in the world. No one can read the history of England without perceiving how very serious some of these matters may easily become. It is the business of statesmen not to let themselves be moved unduly by these feelings, however deep and natural, but to try as far as possible to steer away from these dangerous currents and persevere steadily towards the harbor which they have set out to gain. At any time when you think it useful to have a further meeting with Sir James Craig, I will endeavour to bring it about. I found him reluctant when I addressed him on the subject this last week, but I know that he sincerely desires a peaceful, decent, and Christian solution.